this is my first meeting with the MDG Premium Group. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm excited. I'm excited to have this back and forth during the webinar format. So I'd love to, as I'm kind of going through case studies and discussion points of real world evidence, I want to hear if anyone has experiences, good, bad, ugly, with real world data, because I think this will be a great format to talk about. But my by way of background, I've got a PhD in microbiology, but I've spent most of my career in the medtech area. So I started at Cook and got to know David pretty well. I was started in regulatory science and initially focused in on some interesting products. We were developing devices that were used in introducing regenerative therapies, so cell therapies. And I got, what I found was my love, my interest was focused in on the clinical side. So designing, trying to understand the requirements for clinical strategies, trying to decode what FDA, what notified bodies want to see with regard to clinical evidence. So I moved into the clinical function as a clinical scientist, and I joined at a really interesting time because the company was moving towards meeting the new European medical device regulation requirements, and the entire portfolio had to be basically vetted, reviewed, CERs updated. We had to find gaps in all the files and then figure out how we were going to fill those gaps. And a lot of times we were going to do that through our post-market clinical follow-up studies. So I got to get involved in a lot of different device types, and our team overseed the entire European portfolio's post-market clinical follow-up. And, just as we kind of were starting to get a little bit excited, we were starting to have some of our studies take off, the COVID pandemic hit, and we no longer had access to the sites that we were used to collaborating with, and all non-essential research stopped. We knew we had a little bit of time to help get the, studies up and going following those restrictions, but we didn't have a lot of time. So we had to be kind of scrappy in figuring out what are some other ways we can find, where can we find data? And one of the ways we looked into was working directly with data companies, organizations that had real world data on our devices, and what can we gain from that? Unfortunately, a lot of the organizations, at least 4 years ago, didn't have the data we were looking for. MedTech has a completely different they have different needs than pharma, and a lot of companies weren't catering to MedTech specifically. So number one, just finding our device, right? No, it was interesting to me how we had all undergone this huge transition in putting UDI on our packaging, our device packaging at every level, but there was no counterpart to that in the health systems for actually capturing that UDI. So when we were trying to connect a specific model or device to a patient procedure, that linkage wasn't there in a lot of cases. And then also, a lot of the outcomes we were looking at for medical devices are in the specific to the procedure. So we wanting to know, what are the access sites? What's the target anatomy? We're wanting to know, were there any device related, procedure related complications? Depending on the device, what was the inflation pressure, and how long was the device inflated for? All of those parameters, those were captured in notes in the real world data sets that we were looking at, but we didn't have access to that. Pretty much all we had access to were structured data elements. So demographics, payer codes, labs, prescriptions, those didn't really help us. So we started to collaborate with some other organizations, some academic organizations, also some state-run organizations like where I'm based in Indiana, there's the Indiana Health Information Exchange. And those organizations have greater access to medical records, not just the structured data, but also the notes. And we started to come up with pathways that we could look for in those notes to signal safety signals, performance signals, some of the required data elements we had. So long story short, the company that I work for right now, 3Aware, I'm the co-founder and SVP of Clinical and Regulatory Science, and that was actually born out of a partnership with a medical device manufacturer, Cook, and a health tech company based in Indianapolis that had not only the knowledge of creating a software platform that can securely store data, but also a relationship with huge health systems within the United States, including the Mayo Clinic, which is one of our largest partners. So with further ado, I'm just going to move into my slide deck, but often kind of where I like to start out is just level set, okay, what is real world data? Because I think a lot of times it's easy to, I think folks kind of have a perceived thought that, okay, real world data is a registry data, or real world data is claims data. And that's true, but there's a lot of different types of real world data. So really it's any data that relates to patient health status or the delivery of routine care. So pretty much any clinical data that's captured observationally. And this can be, the source of this data can be electronic health records, it can be sponsor and national device registries, it can be administrative claims database, it can also be patient-generated data. It can be data that comes from, our Apple Watch wearables. It can be data from active surveillance systems. So there's a diverse group of sources that all can provide technically real world data, but they all kind of have their benefits and their shortcomings, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Sometimes I also see the word real world evidence used interchangeably with real world data. But technically real world evidence is the insights that you gain from the analysis of real world data. So I just listed here FDA's definitions for both real world data and real world evidence. And so the data is the source data, what you're looking at, and then once you analyze that and derive your insights to look at the risks or benefits of a medical product, that's the real world evidence.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
So the FDA recently published draft guidance on real world evidence for medical devices, and they talk a lot about fit for purpose. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
Absolutely.
What they mean by fit for purpose, and there are two other words that they use a lot. I can't remember what they are offhand.
Relevance and reliability.
Yeah, you got it. See,
yes.
Expert.
Yep. Well, you're Sean, you're setting me up really well. So I'm going to get into that here in a second. But FDA, we're all struggling with trying to figure out how to use real world data. And we know it's a rich source, but there's not a lot of regulatory guardrails around what is usable and what isn't. And I also think there's a lot of how do I say this, skepticism around it. So we talk with groups all the time who basically say, yeah, but FDA and notified bodies, they don't actually take real world data seriously, or they're not utilizing it, and it's nice to have, but it's not going to do anything to help. It's never going to take the place of an RCT and whatnot. And I think that RCTs are the gold standard, but I'll actually pull up that draft guidance here in a second, just a screenshot of it, and go into it. To that, I would say to the skeptics, there's actually FDA is taking this seriously. Out of the 21st Century Cures Act, there's been a push to utilize to help utilize existing data to make regulatory decisions, and they've created the NEST program, which put together these quality and methods frameworks, utilizing experts in the field, and then FDA has taken those and really updated their guidances. Oh, I see a hand has raised.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Ronald Baums, I'm from the Netherlands. And I always like to promote real world data because if you have a study, you always have these inclusion-exclusion criteria, which can skew things immensely, yes. And you may be avoiding whole target groups. You know, but we see now that a lot of medical products are developed for men and not for women, those things. And if you have real world data, then you have smokers, then you have pregnant women, then you have God knows what, and all sorts of errors, typical use errors also joined in. So I love real world data.
I'm so happy to hear that. And again, I think you set me up nicely for this first point I wanted to make, which is that traditional clinical studies, to your point, are narrow in scope by design. In order to control for sources of error and bias. So, you know, they are on a very narrow population. And so if you're looking at real world data, you know, people think, oh, it's messy, it's heterogeneous, and heterogeneous is often, you know, a dirty word in clinical design. But in the context of representation, real world data is more comprehensive because you see now broader populations. You also see broader clinical professionals using the devices. So again, when you're designing your pivotal trial, you're working with centers of excellence, right? You're working with physicians that are leaders in the field, highly trained. You're highly training them. You're telling them, you know, a very, very controlled protocol, but that's not how the product's actually going to be used in practice. So yeah, I 100% agree. Oh, we got some more.
Amelia, don't worry, we'll keep you busy. In fact, you might, I don't know how many slides you had, but
I can go long or short.
This is we're just storytellers here, and you're teaching us stuff we don't know. So there's no script. You don't have to get through the deck, and we can take things wherever they go. And just because I'm host, I'm cutting both Jose and David to say that I can relate to your COVID story because I was engaged early in COVID with a ridiculous company with a terrible concept, who was, of course, pre-revenue, pre-approval, pre-everything. And they couldn't get, even the hospitals that had signed up to be primary investigators, they just didn't have the bandwidth.
Right.
And they were, and probably did, run out of capital by the time, you know, they couldn't wait for the end of the pandemic because they had nothing to say without any evidence.
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be this is what happened with all these, you know, it can be just these show me anything.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
I'll be polite and ask Mr. Borges to contribute now.
So Amelia gets to be Dr. Hufford, but I'm Mr. Borges. Okay.
Oh, I didn't even remember that you're a doctor. He went to MIT. He's an engineer. He's really smart. He's got 17 children, 2 on the way.
Close. No, but it's funny. My kids make fun of me all the time. They say I'm not a real doctor, but that's okay.
Me too.
You play one
you know,
on
is you know, with the advent and kind of the proliferation of AI and machine learning, I would imagine that that's really one of the areas where real world evidence is going to shine, because when you're trying to train a model, if you're doing inclusion and exclusion criteria, as Ronald was saying, you know, you're going to bias the algorithms. Right.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if you're going to touch on that and like what your thoughts are in general about the impact that AI and real world data together are going to have.
Yes, I've got an example. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's where a group that we're working with is utilizing the data to validate their model. One thing I will say is that real world data is going to grow with the advancements in natural language processing and the advancements in being able to, you know, utilize this technology to pull the signals out of the data. Because again, right now, a lot of these signals that we call it the gold within the data sets they're in these structured notes, right? So hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it's not really feasible, especially if you're looking at a study with, let's say, 10-year follow-up, to read every note of every encounter that patients had for the last 10 years to try to find a safety signal or performance signal. And so I think the technologies and the capabilities that we have, we're starting to see it align nicely with being able to utilize this data that we have in electronic health records and in other sources. Yeah. But I do think there's a lot of uncertainty. And so for the time being, I think we're going to have more AI assisted, technology that is still going to require that human review to fully adjudicate. I don't think, I think there's some hesitancy and utilizing it just to, set it loose on a huge data set. And then tell us, okay, what are the rates of occurrence of these adverse events and device deficiencies? But at some point that will happen.
Any projections?
Well, so NEST and FDA is working on, and honestly, they're not really transparent where anything is at, but they're working on the active surveillance program, which is basically supposed to do that very thing, take in large data sets and look for safety signals across all commercially available devices in the US. I think the possibility is there. I would love to talk with some data scientists to see like what is necessary to validate those, like what are the required inputs to make that a possibility in the short-term future. I just don't know.
I can't help but wonder, you mentioned this, I think, organization called FDA. That was a relic of the past, right?
It may be.
So I don't know that any of the things will change other than just anyone can do whatever they want.
That's a fair point. Yeah, no, yeah, it's really interesting. I think some of the skepticism we're seeing in the usefulness of real world evidence is just how slow. And I would say FDA, if we're looking across the authorities, is probably the most proactive in thinking about real world data. But folks just it's just so slow to take on and have any type of direction from regulatory authorities. So yeah, interesting.
The teacher becomes the pupil. Mr. Chadwick, you have something
Nice
for
job,
Dr.
Amelia.
Hufford?
So just on FDA, before I ask my question, secret meetings behind closed doors again and again and again get us nowhere. And
Right.
there needs to be openness and transparency. I had two little questions that'll probably take the hour to answer, but what about off-label usage in this set of data that you're pulling?
Yeah.
And my second little one is HIPAA.
Yeah.
And who's protecting HIPAA? Who's controlling HIPAA? Even in AI, as someone's question,
Yeah.
is there a switch that anonymizes, or can you, maybe you're coming, but
No,
thanks.
these are really good points. Off-label usage. I would say real-world data is the only way you're going to find off-label usage. Anytime you're working under a protocol, right, prospective protocol, you're not, unless you're deviating and causing some major issues, you're not working off-label. And even, I will say surveys are widely popular right now for meeting PMCF obligations in Europe, and you're not, there's a lot of, I don't think it's necessarily intentional, but you're not seeing, maybe full transparency as far as like choosing to report on patients that you are doing off-label procedures, again, just because, there's some concern there with liability. So yeah, I think if you're wanting to look at off-label use, especially the prevalence of it, we know it's happening, right? I mean, it's completely allowable for physicians to do what's proper and right for their patients in their practice of medicine. And in fact, pediatric products, a lot of times the devices themselves aren't specifically on label for that population, so that they have to. So yeah, I think real world data is where you're going to find those insights, and I've seen it. And we're actually working on a project with NEST and FDA and expanding the label to include a pediatric use on this product that's already on the market, utilizing off-label data. So fair point on that. And the second point, remind me what the second point was.
HIPAA, that little
HIPAA, yes.
acronym, yeah.
Just a tiny thing, yeah. So that is that's obviously the number one priority we have in working with data is patient privacy, data privacy. We actually work with the Mayo Health System, the Mayo Clinic platform, and they've published a paper, I think 2 years ago, talking about how their anonymization process. So it's not straightforward, but basically, in our experience with the data set we have, we do not have any PHI containing data, even though we have access to unstructured notes. And that's because they've been able to validate their particular process in anonymizing names and anonymizing hospital sites and offsetting dates such that, the day of the procedure, the month of the procedure are not true, but the relationship, if you're looking at, the course of that patient's journey, the relationship of how many days post-procedure is maintained. So you can say, okay, if they had this event, it definitely occurred 5 days after the procedure. So that those pieces are vital. And quite frankly, like they in order to be able to have ethics approval of usage, secondary usage of this data, those mechanisms are in place and protected. Europe, interestingly, we're not able at this time to work. There's a couple reasons why we don't have partnerships with European sites. One is the data protection regulation, GDPR. It doesn't allow, it states that our mechanism of data protection isn't stringent enough, so it doesn't allow for the transmission of data to the United States unless it's in aggregate form, and we need that patient level data. So that's an additional stringency. Also, a lot of hospital systems, one of the predicates for us to be able to follow our patients longitudinally and to have that depth of data is that the health systems have to be integrated such that the primary care offices, the ambulatory centers, hospitals, all the patient is connected within the single EHR. So all of their data is captured. That's not as popular or in practice done in Europe outside of the UK, which technically is Europe. And then there's also a prevalence that more hospitals, especially in Southern Europe, are still paper-based. So there's definite reasons why it's a little bit harder to do these types of studies in the EU right now, outside of data privacy.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ron?
I suspended sharing for just a moment because
Sure.
Ronald, you're on mute, sir.
Sorry, there's a startup I'm working with, and they create synthetic data. Do you know that concept? So what they do is they do big data analysis on hospital data, and they can actually do that in Europe because the hospital, as long as they keep ownership of the data, it stays within the hospital, they can use the data to create synthetic patients. You cannot trace those patients back to real people, but real data has been used to create these people. So what they do is just use all the data in the hospital and create that. Now they have a problem that you need to have funding for that. So I'm now making links with companies that want to have use data from devices, so they will pay the hospital to collect the data, and the hospital can use the synthetic data also to analyze their processes and become more efficient. So this is something we're working on now. This is now an Israeli-European project because the startup is in Israel. Would you be interested to be linked to them?
I would really like to talk to you more about that. Yes.
Okay, let's make a link then. Let's make a connection because those guys know much more about what I'm talking about now than I do. I'm sure I'll get your data from Joe, so we can connect. Good. Yeah.
Excellent. And I'm going to show it here before we sign off to my email address. Yeah, thank you, Ronald. All right.
Okay, we'll go to slide 5.
I'm going to actually skip ahead a little bit. Because I think we're pretty familiar, with another, the pros and the cons of the real world data and what we need to look at. David brought up or Sean brought up the draft guidance. I honestly, I really, really like this draft guidance because it not only kind of spells out their expectations, but it also provides a checklist for what you need to include in your regulatory documentation. And then it gives you examples of a protocol and a report. So you basically have the framework for how to create a real world data protocol and a real world data, a clinical study report. So it's still in draft, and it's been that way for almost a year. But I think there's, probably there reasons for that. But if anyone's interested in how to determine fit for purpose, if your data is fit for purpose, and how a regulatory authority might want to see a study designed, and the different parameters for what to include and how to assess if your data is relevant or if your data sources are high enough quality or reliable, look to this draft guidance. Similarly, in the EU, there's not as of yet, any guidance that kind of points you into what the notified body expectation would be for real-world evidence, but there's a group called IDERA, the Integration of Heterogeneous Data and Evidence Towards Regulatory and HTA Acceptance. They're essentially similar to NEST in that they're a public-private partnership. And they're trying to establish Europe's best practices for developing studies using real-world data. So we may have some European guidelines coming out in the near term. So I actually wanted to give a case study, and this is actually, David, this is on a Cook product. So we've published, we've put together a white paper on this partnership. But this was a unique project where they utilized, the study team utilized electronic health record data to meet their post-market clinical follow-up needs. This device is it's a hemoclip. So essentially it's like what it looks like. It's an alligator clip, a tiny, tiny little alligator clip that gets deployed and remains in the GI tract. It can be used either in the upper or lower GI tract of a patient. And it's got multiple indications, which I'll talk about in a second. This device, it's a temporary implant, so it typically sloughs off within 30 days. So it's not a permanent implant, but it's unique. So because of that, Cook really had 3 non-negotiables. They had to be able to link patients to a specific catalog number. So there's a predecessor device that has the same exact name as the new generation device, except I think the new generation device has plus at the end of their name. But if you were to just focus on name alone, which some real-world data sets do, you would not be able to distinguish between those 2 devices. So that connection again between the model number and the patient was absolutely critical. The other thing, they were kind of playing against the clock. They needed to get this data in less than 9 months and show significant progress towards analyzing that data within less than 9 months. And so, if you've set up a clinical study before, trying to put that together, you're looking at least for a prospective study, at least 12 months before the data is going to come through. I mean, it would take 4 to 6 months just to get contracts with hospital sites up and going. So they were running against the clock. And then this device actually has 6 distinct intended purposes. And there were 3 intended purposes where they had a lack of data, and they really needed to focus their data collection on those 3 intended purposes. So again, if you're collecting data prospectively, you're kind of at the mercy of the patient, like just what's going on, what you kind of get what you get when you're enrolling prospectively. And it's interesting. I think about 75% of the usage of this device is in one specific area. And I'll just give you a list of what these purposes are. I think 70 or 75% of the usage is in prophylactic clipping post-polypectomy. That's probably because, you know, like removing polyps during colonoscopies, which we all have after a certain age, is pretty common. So the majority of the use is in this case. But there were 3 uses, endoscopic marking and then anchoring either a jejunal feeding tube or a fully covered esophageal stent. Those were rare, and they needed to be able to have a minimum sample of those patients' uses, again, within 9 months. So they couldn't wait. So the first thing that we did, you know, they designed their prospective study. They also they needed to follow these patients for 30 days. So the expected lifetime of this product is 30 days in the patient, and then it kind of sloughs off by that time. And so it wasn't just, you couldn't just see the patient during the procedure. You had to be able to have access to their data over that time period. Their data elements were actually pretty straightforward. But because there were 6 different intended purposes, there were actually 6 different definitions for safety and clinical performance that we had to follow. And so here are those. So as you can imagine, like the definition of success for endoscopic marking is much different than the definition of success for hemostasis. So there had to be enough detail in the data to distinguish these, you know, find the data to support these different definitions of success. So for instance, was the clip retained at the target for the appropriate amount of time, or following deployment, was initial hemostasis successful? And then safety, same thing. Each had some similarities, but, you know, again, depending on the indication, there were differences in the safety definitions. So I won't go into you know, extreme depth, because we've got a link to the results of this in a white paper that I can share. It's actually linkable from our 3Aware website. But what I can say is that the PMCF objectives were successfully met. Before starting the study, we were able to show them, okay, we have this number of patients with this indication, with each indication. So we could identify patients based on their diagnoses and procedure codes and let them know. And then in some cases, we had to dig a little deeper. We actually had to look at their notes, but we could say we can show you data on these specific indications and include that in the cohort that you're going to see. One thing that was interesting was coding is unique. So I think a lot of folks use coding, you know, to make assumptions of you know, performance and possibly safety, but we've seen mistakes a lot in coding, or just you know, it's used for a completely different purpose. It's used for reimbursement, right? For you know, billing from the hospital. So we would have noted, if we were just looking at the codes alone, we would have misidentified a couple of the indications. So having that totality of data, not just the structured data, but the unstructured data in this case, was important. One thing I will say is that this group had done a study on the predecessor device just the year before, and they had done it via I think a survey, and they noted there were no adverse events or performance failures in that first study, which was a little bit suspicious, because based on these patient populations, we're dealing with very, very sick patients. And a lot of times during, you know, acute GI bleeding, and no deaths. And it was a little bit, I won't say, all I'll say is that when they repeated the study utilizing data from EHRs, they did uncover AEs and performance failures that were in line with what they had expected based on the state of the art. So again, I think when you're working with different sources of data, just be in mind of the potential biases, and you know, be diverse in the data you're choosing, the data sources you're choosing to work with.
Amelia's
yeah.
LinkedIn and her website in the chat for everyone.
Thank you, Joe.
Mhm.
I guess importantly, for this team, there were no deficiencies that resulted from the PMCF study from the notified bodies. So from a data quality perspective, from a regulatory expectation perspective, for that usage, electronic health record data was definitely appropriate. Which again, I think sometimes there's that misconception that real world data isn't acceptable with regulatory authorities, but it just depends. It depends on the study questions. I've got another example we can talk about. This one, it's really, I don't know if folks on this call have a lot of experience with trying to do like 5-year plus follow-up on studies, even in the framework of registries. But this group that we're working with, they kind of had two challenges for bringing their total knee replacement device to the market. One of the challenges was that they needed from Europe, the notified bodies stated they needed 10-year follow-up. And all I'll say is that they did do a clinical study. So this device in the US is 510(k) cleared. So they didn't actually have to have clinical data in getting onto the market in the US, but it's a class 3 implant in Europe. So they had designed a clinical study that included 5-year follow-up, but almost half of the patient sample had either been lost to follow-up or withdrew early before their 5-year visit. So they didn't have an appropriate, according to the notified body, amount of patients amount of data to support 5 years. And then the EU notified bodies also stated that your expected lifetime requires you to actually have 10 years of follow-up data. So they're struggling to get 5-year, and then they're being told you actually need 10-year of data. In addition, there's a patient-reported outcome measures are more and more being requested by notified bodies. And that was not a data element that was included in the initial study that was designed 5 years previously. So interestingly, when it comes to patient-reported outcome measures, they're starting to be recognized as valuable so that you get the patient voice, so that the data is considered patient-focused. And FDA has stated recently that, you know, this information is important because it tells you how patients feel, how they function, how, you know, integrating this into the total product life cycle, you can see not just, you know, the specific measures for your endpoints, but you can see how does this actually benefit the patient over time? Does it have a worthwhile clinical benefit over time, even if this measure is being met? In addition to the regulatory side, hospitals are actually pushing for this information as well. And that's actually recently because CMS and private payers are providing financial incentives to practices that collect and report patient-reported outcome measures. And that specific to the arthroplasty practices or the ortho specialties that are doing knee replacements, if they're pursuing Joint Commission or disease-specific care certification, that's actually a required quality data set that they have to include or show that they're reporting. So now a lot of hospitals are requiring the collecting and reporting of patient-reported outcomes. So that's actually good news for us because that means it's becoming part of standard of care. So it's enriching the data sets that we have access to. And so when we're working with this this company, they the first thing they said is, well, how much follow-up, how many patients do you have that have 5-year follow-up? And then of those, how many are coming back on a routine basis, or maybe not coming back, but at least completing this specific patient-reported outcome measure? And we were able to do that assessment for them. We were able to show we have patients. I think the device had been on the market in the US for 5 years. So we had patients that had, you know, I think up to 4 years follow-up. And then we can follow those patients for the next 6 years to get 10-year data. But what's interestingly was with that 4-year follow-up, each one of those patients had completed the patient-reported outcome measure survey. And I think what's important here is if you're comparing a study to real-world data, this is just standard of care, completing these surveys and checking in with their physician. They're not having to do anything out of the normal, where, again, if you're a patient who's in a study that has 5-year follow-up, there is an additional burden both to the patient and to the site. So I think you're going to see much more compliance and much more a higher availability of this follow-up data in real world data sets versus having a study with a long follow-up. I want to pause there and see if there are any thoughts about that, because I'm curious if anyone has run into that as well.
Raise your hand if you have, because I have a few questions from Eric and Greg.
Oh, yeah.
Among the attendees, but it may not address your thing specifically. So if anyone has something specific about that, otherwise, Eric, I'm opening the phone line for you, and I'm opening the phone line for Greg. You've declined to come on camera. I'm sure you look great, but maybe you're willing to offer your voice to your questions.
Joe, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, that's Eric.
So Amelia, I was just curious, does 3Ware specialize in these certain therapeutic areas? And then if so, where does 3Ware obtain the data, either through health systems, GPOs, or other data sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Answering your second question first, we partner directly with health systems. So currently we are partnered with the Mayo Clinic. So we have access to all of their clinic sites in Minnesota, Arizona, Florida. We've got all of that data. And then that's actually expanding to include other health systems as well. Mercy Health System based in Missouri. And I think a couple other states are that's going to be coming on in next year in 2025. So yeah, we partner directly with the health systems. And then as far as specialties, we don't have we don't target just certain specialties. So we do work with clients ranging from vascular devices to orthopedic devices. However, we're seeing a lot of interest specifically in the orthopedic space because of the need for patient-reported outcome measures, for long follow-up. And also, I think there's, maybe historically there hasn't been, there may be a lot of data gaps in certain devices, especially, some of those accessory devices such as screws and plates that may not have a lot of data. But I mean, we do everything from, hemoclips to knee replacements to, everything in between.
Okay, and Amelia, as a follow-up to that, what's the strategy behind working, or what's the benefit to working directly with health systems, say, versus working with a GPO that already collects and represents a number of health systems?
In our experience, the GPOs aren't, they have a lot of data, right? Hundreds of thousands of patients of data, but they don't have depth in their data. So they don't have the unstructured notes that for medical devices specifically, in case those important elements such as, access site, target anatomy, inflation times, those types of procedural data elements that are needed. Also, too, GPOs, in my experience prior to 3Aware, they didn't have the catalog number connection or the UDI connection. So in some of the data sets, Premier example, they were connected by name, so commercial name of the device, and that's problematic if the device doesn't have a unique name, or in some cases too with devices, a hospital system will switch the type of device they're using. So they may go from the, let's say, Cook XY to the Medtronic Z device, but not update the charge master data to state that. So you're actually collecting data on the Medtronic device when you're looking for the Cook device. So there's a couple differences there, and just again, it's a difference between the needs of pharma and really what those systems were based in collecting, and in medtech where you need that connection. And again, a lot of hospital systems don't collect UDI. So it's hard for the GPOs to ensure, right, that the data you're getting is device specific.
Sure, that's helpful. And last question, then I'll sign off and then other people ask. What about using EHR data sources or registries that would actually include UDI or brand? And have
Yes.
the depth that you're looking for?
Yes. So so again, our data source is EHR data. And that, if you can get it, is a rich source for the medical device manufacturer, because you can get that unstructured data set. And you can also have more control in working with sites that can make that connection between device and patient procedure. Same with registries. If the registry has the information and makes that connection early on in the design, those are also very rich sources of data, highly controlled, high quality sources of real world data that if you're looking at the FDA guidance on, I think they published it maybe 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago on examples of real world data used in decision making. I would say 80% of those are registries, data from registries. So that's a very great option if it has what you need.
Thanks,
We are
Amelia.
at the top of the hour, but we are recording, so some folks will drop off, Amelia, but they'll be able to catch the rest later. Sean, have you invited our guests to join us in May in California? And Sean's finding the button that unmutes himself. Unsuccessfully. In the meanwhile,
I'm unmuted.
yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
being remedial here. Well, no, I was planning on inviting her.
All right. I think
But-
she'd be a welcome addition.
You're as usual 1 step ahead of me, Joe,
Right. I'm 1 step ahead of you in terms of retirement.
as well.
Yes. Greg, you have a very impressive background. You had some questions.
Oh, thank you, Joe. You have an impressive track record of what you've been doing with MDG all these years, and I'm so happy to be up in Boston a couple of times at some of your events. Love them, and I love being online too, but I love more in person and better. But hello. Fantastic presentation. I couldn't catch up with the notes, so this is for sure. I'm going to watch the recording. 2 questions, please. So you call this an RWE, real world evidence study. You don't call it, I'm sorry, what do you call it? Is it a study? Is question 1. And then question 2 is, can you discuss a little bit of the differences between a real world evidence study, or whatever you call it, and how that compares to a pilot study or a pivotal study in terms of costs, number of devices, length of follow-up, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, no, these are it's funny. There's a lot of debate, right, in whether or not data or projects using real world data are clinical studies or not. I think in Europe, they would say no. However, in the US and in my personal opinion, I feel that these are studies, and they should be designed and have the same rigor that you would apply as applicable with any other type of clinical study. So I'm used to following ISO 14155, and I think not everything is relevant in a real world data study, but a lot of pieces are. So again, in my opinion, and what I've read from FDA's opinion, if you want the insights and the evidence from the real world data to be acceptable in making regulatory decisions, then the study needs to be of high quality. It needs to be prospectively designed. You need a protocol. You need a statistically valid sample size. All of the same elements. So I do call it a study, a real world data study. How they compare to the more traditional studies, I think there's never a one size fits all, right? So I think there needs to be, before a device is on the market, there needs to be data supporting the safety and performance of that device. And whether that be you know, via a pre-market clinical investigation, a pivotal study, or whether that be, you know, leveraging data from a predicate device, there needs to be that assessment. Where I think real world data fits, number one, I think real world data is going to provide you what a pivotal study doesn't, which is more representation of patients, and more representation of clinician skills and more representation of actual usage of the device versus, you know, what that narrow protocol mandated in the pivotal study. So I think it supplements those types of more traditional methods, and providing, you know, more data after the product's on the market. And real world data, it's not necessarily the case, but I think in most cases it's observational. So it's data that's coming from commercial use, standard practice. So again, I think it's not going to answer those initial questions of safety and performance. That said, one point that I was going to make later is, you know, what are some other uses of real world data? And we're talking with an organization right now that they want to use real world data to establish benchmarks for their new device. So you can collect data on similar devices. Maybe not, you know, if your device isn't on the market yet, but you know, there's a product code or there's a family of devices, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is the state of the art with regard to these adverse events or whatever. You can use real world data to help inform that type of you know, information to support trials on your device. Also, you can use real world data as control groups. So there's been a push, you know, in cases where you know, for whatever reason, you can't have randomized controls in your study. You know, you could potentially use historically matched patients who were treated, you know, based on the standard of care without your device of interest. And that is another way that real world data can help inform, you know, investigational studies. But in general, I would say, you know, there's needs for all types of those studies.